Let me get started. The talk that I'm giving today is really a sort of distillation and expansion on a short commentary I wrote for Social Media and Society. There was a call for top commentary on what has communication got to do with climate change. And I sort of used that prompt as an opportunity to think a little self-reflexively about some of the wayfinding that me and some colleagues have done about how we situate our own work in relation to the carbon intensity of digital research and research exchange. The commentary does like maybe three things. The first is that per Goffman, we're sort of being asked to think about like a front stage, backstage distinction in how we do research. And this is a sort of like performative model of the researcher where, you know, there's a version of us that we put forward in our writing that's very polished, where none of our errors are visible and we're just extremely confident, authoritative claims makers. But we're encouraged in this section to sort of go a bit backstage, bring the reader with us into how we came to make the arguments that we made and what sort of lingering uncertainties we might have. I think that's particularly interesting when we're thinking about digital systems, when we're thinking about digital systems on a digital system to a digital audience, right? Because it sort of looks like when you're critiquing structures like data centers, you're kind of critiquing the ground that you're standing on in front of your audience. And the front stage, backstage distinction gets really, really muffled, really muddled. And so I kind of want to bring you into this confused position with me. That'll be the topic of the talk, but also a little bit of the method. I've tried to resist my perfectionist impulse to sort of write out a talk, and instead I'm just going to talk with you, at you, and hopefully build a conversation about some thoughts that are kind of lingering. So this will be a little unpolished. It'll be a little bit casual, but hopefully that's a good modality for a Monday morning on Zoom. The second thing that the commentary, the genesis of this talk is doing, is that it's an opportunity to talk about stuff that I've been wrong about. So I wanted some space to sort of think through some concerns or hesitations that I have about statements that I've made before and bring people sort of into the growing ambiguities and uncertainties that I've come to think about with the topic. So at times there'll be a bit of a friendly critique to some of my fellow travelers in data center studies. Though it seems like in all the talks in this series so far, there's a great hunger for nuance in this group, right? And we're all kind of wanting to find that space of candor. And then thirdly, I also just want to talk to you about feelings and emotions. In this prompt towards self-reflexivity, it's important, I think, to sort of think about what motivates, how and why we do the research that we do, what our kind of ambitions and model of power for research might be. So I'm going to be a little bit messy in this front too, but I'll be curious to know to what extent this mess is really a shared one. But I'm going to kick things off in an entirely different spot, talking with you about airplanes, not data centers. So I finished my PhD in 2019. And when I did this, I included an appendix at the back that was a carbon footprint of the research process. And this already was an experiment in self-reflexivity. So I'd written in part about the challenge, both political and aesthetic, about communicating about carbon, this incredibly ubiquitous chemical element that is nevertheless this unit of equivalence that runs across our climate system. And so the dissertation included chapters about why carbon footprinting kind of sucks, and why corporate carbon accounting kind of sucks, and why carbon offsets are kind of a scam, and why all these things together sets us up with pretty limited horizons for climate action, particularly in the 2010s. But in the process of doing all this critical research on carbon footprinting, I also had enough sort of rudimentary skills that I could do a basic version myself. And so I thought I should try this. I'll apply these techniques on my own research practices and see what happens. And the hope was to see whether or not I could put bad tools to good use. And I figured if the whole thing was a disaster, that would itself be worth talking about. But I did find something kind of significant, something extremely obvious, right? Air travel is just a glaringly, overwhelmingly, substantially different kind of actor in my dissertation research. So flying took up 94% of the whole carbon footprint, which came out to like roughly equal of the sum of my entire lifestyle emissions as a broke PhD student for a year living in New York. So like this was clearly the problem to focus on, right? Like no matter what kind of error bars we have with how these emissions get cut, we had a difference in kind, right? Not in degree. And I'm not the only one to make these kind of observations. There is a wider social movement around flying less, particularly in academia. And so you can find things like pledges, decision trees, a lot of Europeans doing these sort of superhuman feats of rail travel to get to distant places to give papers. I've done a bit of studying about this movement and have a paper coming out soon with environmental politics, thinking about how like the strategic terrain in the movement has shifted towards more and more collective strategies for that kind of action. But sort of the genesis is in these sort of individual behavioral refusals. And my own contribution to that conversation has been to try and link the social movement towards critical thinking about mobility and research methods. So I laid out some of these thoughts in a short commentary piece in ESTS, which argues that like any part of our work lives that's fueled by airplanes, that has jet fuel at its core, whether that's like field work or archival research or conferences, can and should be understood as high carbon research, which is to say like distinctly different from the rest of the work that we do and really worth recognizing as such. And so like the invention of high carbon research implies the converse, that there are lower carbon methods and norms worth maintaining or rediscovering or fighting to bring forward. And having made that conceptual cut between the high and the low, we can then ask like what social formations might be visible on either side of that divide. And I'm pretty persuaded that there are equity gains to be found in a low carbon coalition that addresses how we organize academic work. And I can really bend your ear on this topic. I've got some very cheesy inspirational speeches that I hold quite sincerely in my heart. But for the purposes of this talk, like we're going to keep it simple. So planes are bad. Anything without a plane is immediately and demonstratively less bad, right? This is sort of the easy peasy distinction I'm trying to draw here. But of course, mobility has different meanings and ranges of importance in different fields of study. So I can't simply make like a universal claim about academia. I've got to think together with others about how this problem shakes out differently in other corners of the universe. So shout out to the Low Carbon Research Methods Group, which is a network of scholars that I've been very, very happy to help compose and work with, thinking about this problem in the context of the social sciences and humanities. We're sort of intimidated at the prospect of telling medical doctors or ecologists like what they should do, which is a concern that's come through earlier in the series of David's talk, right? So there's already interesting crosstalk in this discussion series. But amongst this interdisciplinary crew, we started to think more critically about the role of digital infrastructure in this picture. So specifically, Yanni Kong, Cindy Lynn, Don Walker, and Brian Sutherland are all amazing scholars who are not only not cool on airplanes, not cool with data centers. So we began really thinking about the idea of Jevons paradox and the kind of potential spillover effects from a hard shift away from planes to digital stuff. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, right? And this became less theoretical and much more of an immediate everyday worry. And, we can say with a lot of confidence that a Zoom call is better than getting on an airplane to have an in-person conference. But in the context of this kind of effervescence of online exchange, right, there is good cause to be concerned about some rebound effects for how we do research. And then also, right, like how much data goes into what kind of cloud, with what kind of redundancies, for what kind of archives. And this group of folks on the screen, we all got together during the second summer of the pandemic and wrote a really rough draft of a book that's still marching forward. Goldsmith University Press, please get back to me. But it was this sort of opportunity for us to think together online about how we can think together online in a better, more environmental way. While also, in the midst of the pandemic, right? Like feeling anxious about many things, anxious about our own capacities to work in times of crisis, anxious about the climate impacts of all of the time we were spending online, and feeling like there was really no obvious win to be had. But the way this did finally shake out was that our research group kind of modified our definition. So low carbon research methods are methods that don't involve planes, but also don't contribute to the proliferation of data centers. And we weren't exactly certain what this might mean in the details and in practice, but it was a really important poll to add to this map that we were charting together. But what does this mean in practice? How do you not contribute to the proliferation of data centers during a pandemic? And amid all of your Zoom teaching and your like kind of underwhelming Zoom happy hours and calls with your family, all of that. And moreover, like, where do we determine what is like digital harm reduction versus actual digital harm, right? Where are we going to draw that boundary between the low and the high and the good and the bad? And how do we make more than just a blind guess? We really didn't have any ground rules or necessarily like the robust empirical expertise that we needed to defend and draft ground rules. So we were sort of in this position where we're following examples and social cues from other people in this space who also seem to be anxious about digital emissions and had this sort of like developing vocabulary of gestures and directions we might think with. And I've been trying to catalog some of these examples because they're really diverse. And the politics of them go in many different directions. And I kind of want to think with you about what they might be. So the first bit of context I'll give is that, writing in the 2010s, in this space, you probably came across a lot of very alarming headlines. There were a lot of stories in the news about, a really, really urgent problem with the climate impact of data centers more broadly. So this is a kind of like, we could chart this as part of the techlash that happened in the 2010s, where the sort of social license of ICT got a little bit rusted. But even so, there were these sort of unusually alarming and empirically questionable claims. Things like a viral video hit would have the same climate impact as a small nation state, or the idea that the ITC sector was on track to consume 20 or even 30% of all global energy use in less than a decade. And the Shift project in France has also really helped push this on a policy angle, arguing that we need to embrace this idea of digital sobriety, which is to say that we need to like make really, really hard social and political distinctions between socially beneficial content and socially useless or corrosive content, and ban the stuff that falls in the latter. And they particularly single out pornography. And I'm like, I kind of don't want to be in a position where I'm making such, practical and moral calls about what is or isn't like good or socially useful data. But you might respond to some of these numbers by simply asking your audience to acknowledge them. So I'm really interested in a practice that a couple of my colleagues have adopted of having an impact statement about streaming media in their syllabi. So the idea is that, we're all going to, as a class, like acknowledge this is a problem, even if we don't have the answer. Here are some things that you, dear student, might want to do to reduce the consequences of watching a video from my class. And that could be streaming less media or lobbying someone, right? Using physical analog storage, these kinds of things. You might also work this problem into land acknowledgements. So in Canada in particular, we have this sort of institutional expectation that we are going to include an acknowledgement of the treaty relationships in the lands in which we speak, usually at the beginning of a talk. So, hey, let me tell you that I'm speaking to you today at Peterborough Ngojiwanong, which is in Treaty 20, the traditional homelands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. But I have this habit of kind of twisting it, and I will then go on to tell you that because I'm using Zoom, the data from this video is probably being stored and routed through an Equinix data center in Toronto, which is part of the Treaty 13 and the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. So, sometimes I might even be even more extra, and I would, trace supply chains and treaty relationships for the energy that goes into the Equinix data center. Or I would ask audiences to do route traces and follow hops between IXPs and cable landing stations, between a couple of points in our call, and then, also all the energy and treaty relationships along the way. And the point is to, sort of emphasize that the maintenance of our digital networks depend on access to land, which is mediated through very violent colonial histories and ongoing practices of dispossession. It sort of bums everyone out at the start of all my talks, which is often an appropriate kind of emotional register for them to proceed, because I'm usually talking about depressing climate stuff. So that's one of the tactics of these digital gestures, right? To sort of ask what existing structures of acknowledgement and recognition there are, even if they are less than sufficient, might also be part of a coalition thinking about this problem. You might also think about conspicuous non-consumption. So I used to do this all the time. I would begin every Zoom call that I was part of or hosting by telling my audience, if you aren't speaking, turn your camera off. And this idea comes from a paper written by Obringer et al. In Resources, Recycling, and Conservation in 2020. It was really highly carried in the news. And I think both me and a lot of news audiences sort of really liked the idea of saying that there was a kind of emotional dividend, or not emotional, environmental dividend to, refusing the surveillance of weird Zoom conferences. And that, we had a kind of moral case for the planet to have different social cues to withdraw from being seen. Or in my case, right, just the idea that our aesthetic expectations for how research exchange should work will probably have to change in a low carbon future. And so a sea of black screens could be encouraging to that end, contrary to the complaints of many professors. Another thing that we could do is have a festival specifically for small media. This is Laura Marx's group at Simon Fraser University. They, for a couple of years, have been having a really, really interesting media art festival, specifically about videos that are 5 megabytes or less, which is about the size of a small PDF. So a lot of artists get there through these really, really extreme acts of compression, and the image kind of degrades and has this kind of punk or minimalist thing going to it. And again, there's this idea that radical aesthetics are going to kind of help us acknowledge or make visible the state of the problem and identify who is hip to it and working to resolve it. And this, of course, brings me to the abundance of solar-powered websites there are blossoming in the world today. The kind of OG solar-powered website was one produced by Low Tech Magazine. I have some ambivalence about citing the creator of the website, Chris Dedector. Turns out he's a vaccine skeptic, so not all low tech is the best tech, I think we would say. But he didn't make the site alone. I think he's often credited more than the folks working on the research project side of the site. Roel Roskam-Abing has a really, really great paper out in the Limits conference from the year before last. The Limits conference, by the way, is really, really great. Please do check it out if you're not familiar. It's a bunch of ICT and HIC designers thinking about what planetary limits might look like as design principles for digital work. And this is a solar-powered website, which means it goes offline sometimes, is a really, really great text that I assign to my undergrads all the time to have them think about what the politics of degrowth might look like in often unexpected parts of their life, like how and when and if they can access a website. And of course, if you've got a bunch of solar-powered websites, you could string them together and make a solar-powered network. And Solar Protocol does this. I am very, very happy to be a part of it. I am the steward of one node among a growing few. all around the world. This just means that I have a little 50-watt panel in my backyard for solar that hooks up to a Raspberry Pi. And the designers of Solar Protocol, Tiga, Alex, and Benedetta, also have a sort of internet protocol underneath the hood of the project, which you can peek at GitHub if you'd like. And the sort of genius of the idea here is that instead of sending you traffic from a data center or like fog node that has the most response time, the quickest response time to you, which usually means it's the most geographically proximate. Instead, if you visit the Solar Protocol website and all the content hosted on that, it sends you to the node that has the most charge in the battery, which is to say, like, the most sunlight at the time where you access it. And so Tiga in particular has a bunch of really interesting writing about how this is kind of like an experiment in natural intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, using the like design logics of natural systems to create the algorithmic conditions under which data moves around. And again, really, really good paper published in this year's Limits conference. So please don't sleep on the Limits conference. There's so much good stuff happening there. We've also written a zine on the hardware part of the Solar Protocol project. If you want to join this community of solar-powered website users and creators, I spent a lot of time drawing out beautiful diagrams of electrical components and circuits and the like. There's also a bit of text in there about me waxing philosophical on the aesthetics of different energy systems. But the hope is that it's just going to sort of serve as like a really accessible way to bring non-tech people into the process of a bit of a DIY tech experiment. The tech experiment with their router, with the small little board computer, and with the solar panel. And in my own solar panel and little Pi computer, I've got a website up for these low carbon research methods group. And you can see that here I'm following what is a kind of evolving normative design characteristic of a lot of these sites. It's basic HTML, static site generation, which means that, there's really just a text file that tells your computer what to do rather than it needing to talk to interesting ad networks or third parties to dynamically generate visualizations based on any information that it needs to know about you. So lower energy, much simpler, and more accessible to screen readers and the like. And this like interest in aesthetics continues in that like it seems like we're all dithering our images. Dithering is a compression algorithm that like gives you kind of like a monochromatic depth with taking up a very, very small amount of data. So again, like the amount of data that needs to move through the pipes to get to you when you visit one of these sites is pretty small. There's also like visualizations of battery charge, and in my case, like a bit of a weather forecast. So there's like hints at what like local environmental conditions are at the site of the infrastructure, and then also how they might change. So can you refresh this website endlessly, or do you need to be miserly because the battery charge is low? The cat is incidental, but I would like to see that be adopted in this like universal design idiom for what solar powered websites should look like. And of course, there's a growing move with people on this call, hello co-authors, to do something similar, but with a self-hosted Mastodon instance. We should check in about this. I submitted a grant in January to hopefully help this along. I love this commentary, and shout out to Stefan for making it happen, about like what it might look like to think about DIY social media and solar energy through a discard studies analytic, right? Like how do we have more conscious control over what we are discarding? It's good stuff. So I've got this handful of gestures that I've bumped into or I've participated in the past 2 years. And it seems like there is, like a small but growing crowd of people who are interested in marking and acting on the climate impacts of digital media in their own like individual, eccentric, but deeply, to me, interesting ways. And I kind of want to ask, right, like what were and are these gestures all about? What are their common characteristics? And maybe are they all equally credible? When do they help us understand how massive data systems actually work? And like, here's the part where turns out I was kind of wrong. There isn't a strong connection between individual user behaviors and the energy loads of networks and data centers. So it's a little hard to grasp this, but the equipment in data centers and certainly in network exchanges is always on. So the energy line is going to stay flat regardless of how much demand or traffic is moving through a lot of these sites. So when I told you in the past to turn off your screen for a Zoom call, because having your video on all the time was a morally irresponsible anti-environmental action, I was totally wrong. That probably does very, very little. The same with the choice whether or not to stream a Netflix show at low definition versus high definition, right? And like this is sort of like a complicated thing to internalize because it feels good to take collective action, and the sort of idioms of environmentalism tell us that like the best way to do good is to do less. But that's actually not the correct way to think about how networks work, and we risk sort of miseducating people who are caught up in these gestures if this is our framework. There's also interesting implications for what this means to how we think about the larger empirical picture about ICT and its climate trajectory, right? So like, although energy use is increasing and data intensity is rising, the overall carbon emissions of the sector have been flat, certainly for the past decade. And they are creeping up today, but like very slowly, not to the extent that you would think about if you believed some of those headlines that I showed you earlier. And efficiency is doing a lot of work in sort of keeping these two lines decoupled from one another. And there are really interesting debates about the extent to which this can continue in the future. But for now, at least, right, like to say that ICT is a climate bomb is probably factually inaccurate. And like the deeper I've gotten into the literature on this question, like frankly, the more confused I get. There's really no consensus on the emissions trajectory for the sector. There's actually just a stubbornly enduring debate. Some folks will say that efficiency measures have got it, and like material innovations will help sort of keep the trajectory going, and that in fact, like ICT will enable more decarbonization than it will itself cause. And so, it's sort of like a net good for the climate system. Others are like, these efficiency measures are going to dry up very soon, and there's going to be knock-on effects. Jevons paradox is going to have it, where it is a problem. And I'm personally quite sympathetic to the arguments for degrowth here, but I'm frankly not confident that I can prove that those authors are right and the growthers are wrong. And so in like a recent piece of writing, I've tried to sort of put those cards on the table and outline this debate as a debate about politics, not only about measurement, while suggesting that there are a few very practical directions we could take to decarbonize the sector without a definitive consensus on the question of whether or not it's growing or shrinking. Because we might not ever get that answer, right? It's really hard to assess the energy and carbon intensity of a globally distributed corporate sector, right? So we can talk more about that if you'd like. The gist of the alternative we're putting on the table here is that network shapes and geographies, rather than just global sizes, could be a good direction to pursue for some decarbonization gains. But this is something that like very large state and corporate actors or very organized social movements would need to really get up to. So I'm kind of drifting away from the low carbon researchers and individuals that I initially set out to try and understand and prefigure. So let's swing back to those researchers, right? Like, what again could we make of the impulse to just be a little extra online to emphatically mark the digital energy and emissions of the terrain on which we speak as a site of concern? as something that needs to be acknowledged, to be made visible, even if it's a system that's like a little bit beyond our control or at times our understanding. I have a few very messy thoughts. I've actually gotten like a little bit of armchair psychology on myself here and tried to cue into the affective dimension of this stuff. So, you know, there's a degree to which when we do these gestures, we're doing communication on both a pragmatic and constitutive end, right? We want to achieve goals. We want to be good environmentalists. We want to achieve, like, change the social schema of the world and how it thinks about the issue. But also, like, we're anxious. And the fact that we don't really understand the empirical complexities on the ground in this incredibly difficult and opaque system kind of intensifies that anxiety. So I don't know whether or not this works more as like an analytic or a metaphor, but the idea of Phatic communication has been useful for me in thinking about what this might mean. So Phatic communication, for those who don't know, is like the communication that exists to sort of not swap semantic information, but to let the speakers know that like the relationship is still there and the tech is working to support it. So classically, it's what happens when you answer like hello on the phone, or is the line still going? Can you hear me? Or when you have a conversation with someone and you open with like, how are you? When you're actually not interested in that answer, and it's very rude for someone to actually respond because you want to talk about something else. It's just a way of ensuring that like the relational and technical protocols are all there, right? It's a kind of precondition for an actual exchange to begin. And I think at least some of these digital decarbonization gestures are working at that level, right? It's just sort of saying like, hi, I'm anxious about this. Are you anxious about this? Like the anxiety line is open. Let's do this together. But of course, you know, if that's all we do, right? If we're stuck making a lot of acknowledgements through and about individual consumer behaviors, we risk being pretty bad empiricists and political actors when we think about the shape of the problem, right? So a common analogy is plastic recycling, right? There is maybe an overinvestment in the morality and compliance of individuals and individual behaviors that ignore like deeper worrying problems about the material chemistries of recycling, or the fact that like consumer waste is just a much smaller problem than constructing or fishing. But because it's the stuff that's most proximate to us, it's really where we are kind of tempted to focus. So where we focus is political and important. But at the same time, it's really clear from the climate anxiety literature that it's emotionally useful to give people something to do with their climate feelings. And like this rings true for my own experiences. It's been really good for me to have something tangible to think with and maintain as I, you know, contemplate climate change and large international trillion-dollar corporations, right? Like I really value the work of maintaining my little solar-powered website, whether that's, you know, like dithering more images for an update or like brushing snow off my solar panel in the winter. I'm kind of sentimental about it because it gives me a way to relate to these really, really big systems, but at a scale that I can understand and impact, and with like the right amount of effort so that it doesn't feel exhausting, but it also doesn't feel inconsequential. It feels good. And I really value the skills I've learned in the course of doing all these experiments, right? It's definitely contributed to my having a better understanding of the materiality of all the stuff I study. And it's been generative for a bunch of different research projects. And it has me thinking about a recent paper by Ethan Zuckerman about the civic upskilling of volunteer content moderators on Reddit. It's a weird aside maybe, but you know, he's sort of trying to provide a digital move away from like the Putnam Bowling Alone thesis about the erosion of civic institutions in contemporary life. And the hope is that, you know, by learning to mediate disputes and organize communities on a subreddit, those moderators will be better equipped to participate in a wide range of like democratic forms offline. And this is definitely a speculative analogy, but I like to think of all the solar PV and web design work my peers and I have been doing as something that has a similar kind of end course, right? It's preparation for something that we don't fully know in advance, but is useful in facilitating a range of different decarbonization strategies. And maybe that kind of like secondary effect is equally, if not more important than the grams of CO2 we've maybe avoided in our projects themselves. And at the same time, like this story doesn't give us a clear answer about what we should actually do about those data centers. I'm still thinking about it. But one preliminary direction that I really like comes from Mel Hogan. Shout out to Mel Hogan. She's on the call. And she's got a really great chapter in Saturation, which lays out the idea of the data center industrial complex, which we can maybe bug her to expand on further. But is this sort of idea that it's not like discrete consumer actions that cause more data centers to be built, but it's instead this sort of reifying belief that we need endless data storage that then has us building more data storage, that has us then believing that we need more data storage. So the focus really here is on beliefs and business models rather than behaviors. And like, in my like little crib version of this, right? I think this means we might shift away from asking, you know, is this one digital action more or less carbon intensive? And instead ask, does this help prevent the next data center from being built? So it's a very different kind of political terrain to work in. And there are more tools available, right? It's not just whether or not you stream more Netflix, but whether you like show up to your city planning meeting, which might help us get a little more done. But at the same time, I think we do have to do more than just study the problem, particularly if we want to sustain strong social movements and if we don't want to personally burn out on the topic and then, you know, like need to go study organic wine for 3 years or something. No shade to those that do. This is a minor fantasy of mine. And on that register, on this question of affect and how we sort of sustain scholarly work on tricky topics, like I find critical making in media art to be immensely useful because it really gives us like a different way of sitting with a problem and defining what knowledge or action could be for us or needs to be for our peers, right? Again, like I really want to take seriously the kind of affective dimension of climate stuff and think about what is useful not only for finding new knowledge for the problem or like new political actions, but forms of emotional resiliency that we're all going to need because this is going to be a really long-term problem, definitely a marathon and not a race. But I don't want to pretend that like between these two impulses, I've got it figured out. So I'm going to be incredibly rude and turn the question back on you, dear audience, and ask what you think. What should we actually do about all these data centers? And that's it. That's it for me. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation here and hearing your thoughts.